Okay, as long as we're on Google, Google Alphabet did not have a good week.
No.
And this is one of those, this is a story that will be told for many years. I mean, we all have this collection. I actually wrote a column when I was writing a column for the New York Times. I actually did a story on screwed up demos, where you make a public presentation, you show off the new product, the prototype, you go to all this work, you spend millions of dollars on the event, and then you screw up the actual demonstration. And Google did that this week with Bard, which is their new competitor to ChatGPT, right?
Right. And this was really embarrassing for Google because Google was an earlier mover than ChatGPT or OpenAI, which is the San Francisco startup getting all the attention. And Google kind of downplayed AI because people were nervous about it. And then they just flat out got passed. And OpenAI was the young, sexy company. Microsoft invested billions. Microsoft got all the love. Did you see Microsoft's market value this week when it came out with, of all things, a revamped Bing? Who knew that that would be worth hundreds of billions of dollars in stock market value? But Microsoft soared past the $2 trillion level. And then Google came in with its Bard, a strangely named thing for AI, and just made it look like they'd been stumbling and slow and late to the party that was kind of originally their party. And it was stunning to see Google screw this up so much.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Friday, February 10th installment of the Silicon Insider, the only uncensored look at life and business in the Valley. My name is Mike Malone, and I'm here with special contributor Scott Budman, technology reporter for NBC Bay Area. Our producer is Jordan Henderson. Our East Coast correspondent is Bob Grove. And our host, as always, is the Silicon Valley Business Journal. Okay, Scott, so kind of a potpourri this week. We didn't have any massive tectonic shifts like we had in stock prices last week, but we had a few layoffs, right? Yahoo.
Yeah. Oh, it's funny that you bring that up. You know, it seems like
it's sort of like hearing that the Assyrian Empire is fading away. I mean, isn't that kind of an old story? I mean, who knows about Yahoo anymore except business?
It certainly doesn't mean the same in the Bay Area to know that Yahoo is cutting a bunch of its staff. I mean, they're so far removed in a corporate way, in a personnel way, in a technology way than when they were here running the show. And it's interesting that in a week that had both a lot of layoffs and I think a pretty big shift in the way that the biggest tech companies are now battling in this AI arms race.
Yeah,
you're leading with Yahoo layoffs of all things.
Well, I wanted to get it out of the way.
Yeah,
1,600 people, 20% of the workforce.
Yes, and
once you get above 10% of the workforce, which everybody else has been doing, you're announcing you're dying. I think. I mean, but we know they're dying. They've been dying for a long time.
Right. I mean, they're part of what the Verizon sort of empire at this point, and out of Virginia, I think, and they're hanging in there, but as a name more than a relevant technology. Right.
Yeah. Okay. Lyft though. Lyft had tanked in trading. Its stock went down like crazy because it expects to make roughly 975 million revenue for the first quarter, rather than the 1.09 billion analysts anticipated. What's wrong with Lyft?
Lyft is just in Uber's shadow, and it seems that at least the stock market, not to mention many, would-be riders, are putting Uber as the ride share, not only principle, but as the ride share verb. I mean, remember how other search companies struggled when everyone said they were going to Google something. And, way back in the day when copier companies struggled because people said they were going to Xerox something. I think Uber has just become, and it's had its financial and stock market struggles as well. But I mean, the Uber market cap is something like $70 billion and Lyft is somewhere around 4 or 5 billion. And it's just such a giant gap that they're really not even competing as much as I think Lyft thought they would when they were both public and both hot and, just both really, really out there.
Yeah, they're now the term for the process, right? I mean, Uber is. It's like when you go in the South and you order a Coke, they just give you a Dr. Pepper automatically because Coke is the generic term. I remember when I was at the Mercury, if I ever wrote Xerox something, I would get a note from the lawyers at Xerox saying, please do not use that term as a verb, because I knew what it was. They were trying to maintain the copyright that if it got too much into general usage, I don't hear anybody say, I got a Lyft. No, you say, I got an Uber. I mean, that's, even if they're talking about getting a Lyft, I think.
And that's part of the problem. And it's also sort of second mover concerns and just the smaller company. They've always been smaller than Uber. And whereas remember in the early Uber days, and therefore the early rideshare days, you had Travis Kalanick just coming out swinging with both fists at a time when you could never really name the founder or CEO of Lyft. They just weren't in the ring nearly as much as Uber was. And Uber was richly rewarded with all that VC money. Remember, at a time before SpaceX, and before Theranos, even Uber was one of the very first companies to have a $50 and a $60 billion valuation as a private company. And now they're not much above that as a public company, but it's still weighted, they have all the weight and all the, I think the action and all the attention in the rideshare world.
It's interesting. You can almost count on one hand. We always talk about first mover advantage, but first mover winners are actually rather rare. It's oftentimes the second or third in technology, especially hardcore hardware, getting in after the first company caught all the arrows, and you come in with the improved product. This is an example, and even Apple wasn't the first mover into personal computers. I mean, this is a case where the first mover won, and that's worthy of attention by itself.
I mean, they've won so far, and it's still relatively young, and I still don't know that we can say for sure that ride sharing or how much of this sort of gig economy is going to be around in 5 or 10 years. But it's interesting. I mean, you mentioned off the top of the show Yahoo. They were a much earlier mover than Google. Yes. Google is worth $1.2 trillion as of this moment. Yahoo is, where are those guys again when they're laying people off? I mean, people just don't have any idea. Yeah, I mean, other than maybe your fantasy football, nobody's using Yahoo, and they've just gone out of relevance and out of circulation.
Okay, as long as we're on Google, Google Alphabet did not have a good week.
No.
And this is one of those, this is a story that will be told for many years. I mean, we all have this collection. I actually wrote a column when I was writing a column for the New York Times. I actually did a story on screwed up demos, where you make a public presentation, you show off the new product, the prototype, you go to all this work, you spend millions of dollars on the event, and then you screw up the actual demonstration. And Google did that this week with Bard, which is their new competitor to ChatGPT, right?
Right. And this was really embarrassing for Google because Google was an earlier mover than ChatGPT or OpenAI, which is the San Francisco startup getting all the attention. And Google kind of downplayed AI because people were nervous about it. And then they just flat out got passed. And OpenAI was the young, sexy company. Microsoft invested billions. Microsoft got all the love. Did you see Microsoft's market value this week when it came out with, of all things, a revamped Bing? Who knew that would be worth hundreds of billions of dollars in stock market value? But Microsoft soared past the $2 trillion level. And then Google came in with its Bard, a strangely named thing for AI, and just made it look like they'd been stumbling and slow and late to the party that was kind of originally their party. And it was stunning to see Google screw this up so much.
So they asked a question about the James Webb Space Telescope, and it came back and talked about, it took the very first pictures of exoplanets. And I guess all the scientists in the audience must have gasped at that moment, because that's not true. And
they either gasped or they were relieved, because it's like, we still know something more
we still
than an AI-based computer. Yes.
Yeah. Boy, I mean, talk about impact. The company's stock fell their value fell $100 billion in one day. That's not a good day. Even if you're as big as Google is, that's not a big day, a good day, a positive day, an optimistic day about the future.
just a couple of days after Microsoft, on its announcement of AI, gained $100 billion. So this was a $100 billion move, either positive, if you're Microsoft, or negative, if you were Google. And it's just stunning to see the way those two companies, moved with AI.
Did you ever get a chance to go up to Google's advanced research operation up in South San Francisco? It was they called it a campus.
Yes.
And it actually lived up to that, because I remember being up there talking to people, and like nobody was in a hurry. Nobody had a gun at their back saying, we got to get this new product technology to market. It was sort of casual. And I thought, will these guys ever get a new product to market? And I think we're seeing maybe, the long-term impact of that. A company kind of happy where it was sitting in control of the market and in no hurry to try out any new ventures. And when they do, it's a half-assed job.
Well, right. I mean, Google's really big, and they are really, really like that big ship out in the open ocean that just can't turn very quickly. But you could say the same about Microsoft. They're just as big, if not bigger, and they've been around even longer and even more stayed in their ways. I mean, famously, Microsoft has really done badly when it tries to come out with, say, a Zune or any sort of a phone or anything like that. And yet, by investing and propping up the young company, in this case, OpenAI, with ChatGPT, they really made a fantastic move. And that's why they were able to move so quickly with its AI offering.
I think part of it is Microsoft, they ruled the world, but then they fell and they went through the valley of the shadow of death. And I think they've come back a little wiser and a little more energetic over the last few years. And that, maybe Google's heading into its own slew of despair. I'm sure using a lot of literary analogies, but you know what I mean?
Almost as if you put them in ChatGPT and asked for some literary.
Yeah, exactly. And well, let's keep going about ChatGPT. A professor in Australia just came out with a piece talking that, this could be a data privacy nightmare, because, all these new AI programs will search through your entire virtual life, everything you've ever posted on the web, and use that as fodder for whatever they're creating for you. And it could be, we called it a data privacy nightmare in the making. Are you hearing that?
Yeah, and I think it's no accident that with all of this stuff kind of coming to the fore, we also heard from President Biden this week in the State of the Union. And one of the things he was really, really concerned about was data privacy. This makes sense. Politicians have been worried about spying and data and all of that, especially on young people, whether it's Instagram or TikTok. And it was interesting, in a political time of fighting, and even in a State of the Union speech where people were yelling at each other, one thing, and I've said this before, that Biden was able to get unanimity on, I mean, absolute standing ovation on both sides of the aisle, was coming down on big tech and privacy. And we really know how people feel about that, whether you're Democrat or Republican. I mean, our two sides couldn't agree on the spy balloon even, but they can agree that people are spending too much time on TikTok. And it really says something that this week came out with the technology that it came out with, and the potential uses of that technology, and at the same time, a whole wave of condemnation for big tech when it comes to privacy from the political sector.
Yeah, they're winning. They're winning on the political side, but they're not necessarily winning on the tech. Seems to be winning on the Justice Department side right now, though not with the EU. We're losing. Twitter just had a bad week with the EU, because the EU has this new ruling about disinformation, and I guess Twitter sent them an incomplete survey answer and reply, and they failed the test, almost out of arrogance. Either they're too distracted or they're so arrogant they don't feel that they need to answer the EU, and I think that's usually a big mistake.
Well, no one's accused Twitter of being arrogant at the top these days, right?
No, never.
And what a week for Twitter. So Wednesday night, I don't know if you were trying to be on Twitter or just about any social media thing, but a lot of it went down. Instagram briefly down, Facebook briefly down, but Twitter really got hit hard on Wednesday, late afternoon into evening. You couldn't tweet. Some of us who do this for a living figured out that you could if you post dated it or said, I'm going to do it a couple of minutes from now, and then it tweeted, but you still couldn't DM anybody, you couldn't follow anybody. It gave messages like, you've already followed enough people for the year. That's an astronomical number, and it was just making things up as it went along. And it was harkened back to the days of the fail whale, the early Twitter days, when it probably had a staff that's about as big as the staff now after all the cuts. Right. And it's hard to, mobilize a small staff when things are crashing and burning. And it was just one of those things that brought to the forefront how Twitter is struggling with a much smaller staff.
So let me mention real quick, it's the Digital Services Act in the EU with the 2022 Code of Practice on Disinformation, which was agreed on last summer. We're going to be hearing more about that. So, keep that in the back of your mind. And also, Twitter was the only tech company that provided an incomplete report. Maybe Elon ought to hire back at least some of the people that file for grants and reports. In addition, now, a whole new subject. General Motors. Did you read that? General Motors just signed an agreement with a tech manufacturer, Global Foundries, to make semiconductors for GM's various electronics suppliers. And Global Foundries is in upstate New York. They're bringing it back. They're basically bringing back production of electronics domestically, which I think is a sign of things to come. But I also think it's a sign that there's actually a foundry in the United States they can go to. And the fact they're not going through the semiconductor manufacturers means that GM now believes it has a sufficiently developed semiconductor design operation that can produce this stuff. They don't need to go to these big names anymore, like Intel.
Right. I think if this works, it's significant in a couple of ways. I mean, for one thing, like you say, manufacturing, chip making back here in the United States, that's good news, especially with, concerns about either foreign workers or our relationships with other countries. But also, GM has been on something of a roll, at least for GM, getting into the EV market, making cars that people are calling sexy again. People are appreciative of the efforts of the CEO, Mary Barra. They're moving the stock price higher. But what was a really big speed bump for GM? The chip shortage. And it really hit their bottom line. And they said, we have all these great plans and we have all these cars and trucks we want to make, but for the lack of chips. And those semiconductors are super, super integral and necessary as we get into EVs and just all the technology that dominates cars these days. And for General Motors to rely either on other countries or companies like Intel, I think it's just something that they were probably feeling burned by.
I bet they were furious. Yeah. Now, there's one word of warning, though. We saw this once before in the history of Silicon Valley. Companies decided we don't need National Semiconductor or Intel or Fairchild. We will have our own internal semiconductor design and, masking and all that operation. Worked real fine at first, but very quickly the companies dedicated to semiconductors, those other companies, sprinted past these firms, and suddenly these giant companies found themselves with an in-house chip operation that was obsolete, overpriced, and everything else. So the question is, can the GMs and the Fords and whoever else is going to do it, General Electric, can they keep up the pace of Moore's Law?
I don't know, but it seems like in GM's case, they're not turning into a chip maker, are they? They're just sort of outsourcing it to a company out of upstate New York.
Fabrication.
Okay. So, yeah, but I mean, look at Apple. There are some companies that have been able to at least design their own chips and then reach out to, in Apple's case, it was Intel for a while. In other cases, it's been Qualcomm for a lot of the mobile phone companies, and, NVIDIA's in there now. And of course, AMD is back as a leader. So it is an interesting area that's seeing growth. I just, in GM's, I mean, who knows if GM can pull it off, but I think the one area that they really did get burned badly in was that chip shortage that they couldn't get their hands on.
The EV Camaro waiting to come off the line, and you can't put an engine computer in it because you don't have the chips. That's a supply chain disaster, and it must have cost that company tens of billions of dollars.
Right. And, they want to get their trucks out there, their EV trucks, because they're a leader in that. And to see,
Yep.
Rivian out there with trucks, and who knows when the Cybertruck is going to come out from Tesla. But, GM is saying we want to get ours out there and really be a leader like we have been in gas powered trucks. And that makes sense, but they need the chips to do it.
Okay, finally, the board of directors of Robinhood has I'm going to get Sam Bankman-Fried in this week because it's required right now. The board of directors of Robinhood has approved a plan to buy up to 55 million shares of bought by Sam Bankman-Fried last year. So at least they seem to be stepping up on some of this. A lot of firms that benefited from FTX haven't really stepped up to make recompense like we would have thought they would.
Yeah, this is an interesting deal when someone is likely going to prison for fraud in your industry. And by the way, they're a pretty major shareholder in your company that's in the same industry.
In the same industry.
That's pretty incestuous. And I don't quite know how to untangle that other than Robinhood buying back the shares, I guess. And then they can say, oh, that guy, we have nothing to do with him.
Yeah, never heard of him.
Right. So it's
read about him the other day in Fortune, but that's the first time I ever heard of that guy.
Right. We have no business dealings with that guy. He's involved in fraud. We are absolutely not. Robinhood has all sorts of problems in terms of, what is it doing as a publicly traded company, et cetera. But
just a mere mention Robinhood makes me chuckle because we have spent the last 2.5 years following the incredible story of that company. It's just so bizarre. And if I had to put up money, I would have guessed Robinhood would be a scandal before FTX was, because it just seemed like nothing was really real at Robinhood.
Right. Well, FTX came to a lot of people's consciousness when all the bad stuff started going down. Yeah. Other than that, it was a rich guy who was bringing politicians together and funding political parties and things like that. Robinhood obviously was in the news, and there are entire movies and books written about how it was the engine that was used to drive these meme stocks. And the surprise to me was that after all of that was revealed to be something of a Ponzi scheme, that Robinhood was still able to go public. I think that was probably the second most surprising IPO of the last few years to me, below only WeWork. And how those two are somehow public is, I don't know if it gives me faith in the the stock exchange or less than faith, but they're somehow being traded on the stock markets.
Isn't WeWork coming back? Haven't I read some stories that like they're reconsolidated after Chapter 11 and they're trying to start up places and whatever they're doing?
Sure. No, WeWork was a company that, had it not gone so far out of control. Think about this, Michael. You had a way to work away from the office. Can you imagine if WeWork had just stayed somewhat solvent and successful, whether or not it had that big crazy IPO that ultimately burned the company? Imagine the
not had a megalomaniac CEO.
Right. Imagine it's still solvent and the pandemic happens. It's sort of a fan fiction thing, but I think WeWork would have been a really, really big company. But for the fact that it took the life out of its own momentum and had to crash and burn first before rebuilding. And now it is a public company. It's doing all right. People are using their WeWork offices. But imagine during the height of the lockdown, if they were able to say, hey, we have safe places to go and work and, that kind of thing. Right. But the timing just didn't quite work out.
Well, and after all the recent layoffs, they'd have an enormous inventory of office space empty that they could use.
Yeah, I for all we know, they still do. I'm not sure how much they were able to unload, but it's a much smaller WeWork than it was in the heyday, whatever.
And probably the size it should have been at the IPO, and not done an IPO.
Right. So now you can buy shares in WeWork if you want to be part owner. Same with Robinhood, at least for the time being, and they will be able to say, and I'm pretty sure it's a PR move, oh, that guy, Sam Bankman-Fried, FTX, we have nothing to do with that. That's a different company. We are legit.
I wish we had a flashing chyron right here that would, or under you, that would just say frothy. And he's blinking on and off whenever we talk about Robinhood or WeWork or any of those. Okay, finally, this is just a weird Valley story. I don't quite know what to make heads or tails of it, but it's in my town. But we have a developer who is going on a hunger strike, and he's willing to die because the city of Sunnyvale is delaying giving him a permit for some construction. Do I have that right?
I think that's the outline of the story. I was reading about this in the San Jose Mercury News. They did a good piece on this, and I couldn't help but be taken with, I mean, you know, say he's over the top, whatever, but there is a metaphor here. It takes so long in a big city, or even in the Bay Area in general, to build housing. And he's saying, well, I'll die, you know, whatever. But are we not really putting lives at risk by not building enough housing? Therefore, there is a big unhoused problem. And a lot of it comes back to the city that just won't make it easy for these developers who want to do the work and want to build the much desperately needed housing, and they can't do it. And lives are suffering because of it.
Good point. He should have done a little more due diligence, though. I mean, I've had 5 neighbors around me do a lot of rebuilding on their homes, adding stuff and all that. Every one of them, I talk to them while it starts, and they go, oh, yeah, we expect to be done in about 4 months. And then I see them, and they've been living in an apartment for 8 months, and they're still waiting for their permit from the city of Sunnyvale. This town is notorious for taking endlessly to give you permits. And if this guy is going to not eat until he gets that permit, you know, rest in peace.
Well, and right, I hopefully he'll eat before, you know, dire things happen. But really, people who have nice homes and have nice lives can't get so much as a bathroom put in or anything like that without waiting months and months and months. So imagine the situation we're in when it comes to homeless people and trying to build enough housing for them. And we just
while you're waiting for a low-income home.
Right. It's really sad. And it's that guy's hunger strike, I think, is a microcosm of a really, really big problem here in the Bay Area.
I think you're right. Okay, that's it for now, folks. You can find us on the Silicon Valley Business Journal homepage, as well as on Spotify, Anchor, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, LinkedIn, and YouTube. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.